My family laughed when they saw the save the date. They actually laughed. My mother, my father, my sister, and her fiancé all sitting around that glass dining room table in their Brentwood home, just openly laughing at a card I had spent 2 weeks designing. My mother said the venue sounded rustic, which was her polite word for cheap. My sister called it a lakeside picnic. And my sister's fiancé, Sterling, leaned back in his chair and said, very slowly, like he was explaining something to a child, "You're having people drive 40 minutes outside the city to watch you get married in a field." What none of them knew was that the field was a 230-acre private estate on Old Hickory Lake, assessed at $68 million. What none of them knew was that the quiet man sitting beside me, the one they called a hobbyist coder who hadn't found his direction yet, had just been named to the Forbes 30 Under 35 list that was scheduled to publish in exactly 3 weeks. What none of them knew was that Sterling himself was already under federal investigation, and that within 6 months, the words securities fraud would be attached to his name on every major financial news outlet in the country. And what none of them knew was that when my mother finally sent that desperate, fawning text message, asking if they could please come to the wedding after all, I would read it, set my phone down, and type back exactly 4 words. "You're not on the list." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where you understand why the ending felt like breathing clean air for the first time in my life. I grew up in the kind of house where everything looked perfect from the outside. My parents, Ruth and Jean, built their entire identity around appearances, the right zip code, the right country club membership, the right daughter. And the right daughter was always my younger sister, Darcy. Darcy had their coloring, their social ease, their talent for walking into a room and making everyone feel like they'd been waiting for her. I was the one in the background taking notes. I was the quiet one who got straight A's and no one mentioned at dinner parties. I became a forensic accountant, which impressed exactly no one in my family. "You count other people's mistakes for a living," my father said once, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. When I met Miles 3 years ago at a small tech conference in Austin, I almost didn't talk to him. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, nursing a cup of coffee by himself near the back wall, and he looked like someone who'd wandered into the wrong building. I asked him what he did. He said he built payment systems. I asked for who. He smiled, just a little, and said, "For myself, mostly." I didn't think much of it at the time. What I found out slowly, over months of dating, was that Miles had quietly built a financial technology platform that processed microtransactions for mid-sized retailers across the country. He didn't talk about it. He didn't post about it. He drove a sensible used Subaru and made his own coffee at home and wore the same rotation of plain t-shirts. But the company was real, and it was growing, and the people who knew about it were the kind of people who didn't need to announce themselves at dinner parties. My family, of course, knew none of this. They saw the Subaru, they saw the t-shirts, they heard software, and they translated that into still figuring it out. My mother was relentlessly kind to him in that specific way that meant she felt sorry for him. My father shook his hand once with the grip you use on someone you've already decided doesn't matter. And then there was my sister's boyfriend, fiancé now, Sterling. Sterling Voss, managing partner of Voss Capital Private Equity, headquartered in a glass tower downtown Nashville. Sterling wore custom suits and talked about dry powder and portfolio optimization at the dinner table, and my father practically glowed every time he did. Sterling drove a Porsche SUV. Sterling had a membership at a golf club I'd never heard of, which I later found out required a $75,000 initiation fee. Sterling once left a dinner early because he said he had to jump on a call with Singapore, and my mother actually said after he left, "That man is going places." The night I announced my engagement, my family was sitting around that same glass table in Brentwood. My mother had made her good chicken, the one with the herbs she only used for company, which meant she was in a generous mood. I waited until after the main course, and then I took out the save-the-date cards I'd had printed. Cream cardstock, simple script, Miles's lake property address in small lettering at the bottom. I passed them around. My mother held hers at arm's length like it needed better lighting. My father turned his over and looked at the back as if there might be more information there. And my sister read it, set it on the table, and looked at Sterling with this little half-smile that I knew from childhood. That was her watch this face. I told them it was going to be an intimate ceremony. Close friends, a few family members. Miles had the property, the space was beautiful. We wanted something that felt real instead of performative. I said I thought they'd love it once they saw it. My mother cleared her throat. She said, "Honey, that's very you." She said it like very you was a gentle diagnosis. My father asked how many guests. I said maybe 60. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was being patient with someone he didn't expect to understand reason. And then my sister put both hands flat on the table and said she actually had some news too. She and Sterling had just booked the rooftop ballroom at the Pinnacle Hotel downtown for their official engagement gala. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a live jazz quartet, catering by a chef I recognized from the Food Network. She reached into her bag and slid a glossy invitation across the table. Gold foil, heavy paper stock, the kind of envelope that feels expensive just to touch. I already knew what was coming before she said the date. September 14th. The same Saturday I had already told them twice, was our wedding date. The one I'd spent 4 months planning around, the one our 60 guests had already marked on their calendars. I asked her why. She said the hotel only had the rooftop available on that particular Saturday. And Sterling really wanted the rooftop, and a small outdoor thing can be rescheduled so much more easily than a full venue booking. She said this without a flicker of guilt. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. My mother looked at me and said, "Cora, you're not locked into anything yet, are you?" I told her I absolutely was. My father said something about how Sterling had already made a substantial deposit, and that the Pinnacle was not the kind of place you pushed a booking around, and that the family needed to show up for important occasions. He looked across the table at Miles when he said important occasions, making it clear he was distinguishing Miles from that category. Sterling leaned forward then, and I want to describe this carefully because I want you to understand exactly who this man was. He folded his hands on the table, adjusted his French cuffs, and said he had a thought. He said he understood that finances could be tight when you were early in your careers, and that he wanted to help, and he pulled out a checkbook, an actual checkbook, leather cover, like a prop from a different decade, and wrote a check for $2,500. He said, "Put this toward a reception hall downtown. Get a real caterer. Don't make your parents sit on wooden stumps next to a lake." He slid the check across to me. Miles put his hand over mine under the table, very calm, very still. I looked at the check, then I looked at Sterling, then I pushed it back. I told him we were completely fine financially and that I appreciated the gesture, but we didn't need it. I told him our venue was already set, our date was non-negotiable, and that I hoped everyone could find a way to celebrate with us. My mother said I was being stubborn. My father said I was making this harder than it needed to be. My sister looked at the ceiling. Sterling picked up the check, folded it once, and put it back in his jacket. And he looked at me with something in his eyes that I now recognize as fear dressed up as contempt. Because I want to tell you something about forensic accountants. We notice things. We notice when someone reaches for a checkbook instead of a card. We notice when the handwriting on that check is rushed and jagged, like the hand of a person doing math in their head under the table. We notice when a man who supposedly manages hundreds of millions of dollars in private equity doesn't want to leave a digital record for $2,500. I noticed all of it. And then I thought about the financial reports I'd spent the previous 4 months quietly pulling together, not because of Sterling specifically at first, but because Miles had asked me to look into a pattern of short selling targeting several of his company's early investors. Sterling's firm kept appearing in the data. It kept appearing, and I kept pulling threads, and what I'd assembled was going to matter very soon. I didn't say any of this at dinner. I just picked up my purse, took Miles's hand, and we walked out. The weeks between that dinner and the wedding were exactly as ugly as you'd expect. My mother called with strategies. My Aunt Phyllis, my father's older sister, sent a text calling me difficult and saying I had always had a chip on my shoulder about Darcy. My cousin Wade, who I had not spoken to in over a year, somehow found it necessary to weigh in on my Facebook page, saying I was embarrassing the family by refusing to compromise. My sister posted an Instagram story of herself looking dramatically exhausted with the caption, "When you just want to celebrate love and the world makes it complicated." And our relatives flooded the comments with heart emojis and their own personal assessments of my character. I took screenshots of everything. Habit of profession, you document. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me about my grandmother's brooch. My grandmother had left it to me specifically. It was in the will, notarized, explicit. A vintage cameo surrounded by small seed pearls, modest but genuinely old, the kind of piece that carries more weight in memory than in market value. She'd given it to me a year before she passed and said, "Don't let them take this from you." At the time, I thought she was speaking generally. Now I understood she was not speaking generally at all. My mother asked, very casually, if I would let my sister borrow the brooch for her engagement photos. I told my mother that the brooch was no longer available as a standalone piece. She asked what that meant. I told her that I'd had the cameo removed from the original setting and incorporated into my own engagement ring, which a jeweler in Nashville had custom designed for me. The stone was legally mine. It was now part of my ring. My mother could have the original empty brooch frame if she wanted it as a keepsake. There was a very long silence on the line. She asked me to meet my sister for coffee to work it out in person. I agreed to that meeting because I wanted my sister to see it for herself. The coffee shop was a place my sister liked in Midtown. Exposed brick, single-origin pour-overs, women in blazers on laptops. I got there early and ordered a latte. When my sister walked in 20 minutes late, she was carrying a tote bag that cost more than my first car and wearing an expression that said she had already decided how this conversation would end. She sat down across from me and immediately said, "I really need you to just be reasonable about this, Cora." I didn't say anything, I just looked at her. She said she needed the brooch for the engagement photos because the pearl setting would photograph beautifully against her dress, and our grandmother would have wanted her to have something meaningful for this moment in her life. And could I please just stop making everything into a battle? I set my left hand on the table between us. It took her a moment. Then she saw the ring, the custom band Miles had commissioned, with the antique cameo set in a modern bezel in the center, the original pearl surround worked into the band itself on either side. My sister stared at it. Then she said very quietly, "You had it reset." I told her yes, it was mine to reset. She stood up fast enough that her chair scraped back against the floor. She said, loud enough that the two women at the next table looked over, that I was a selfish person who had spent her entire life quietly undermining her, and that I would regret this when I was standing in a field in September, with 40 people and a rented speaker system, while she was at the pinnacle with 200 guests and a jazz quartet and a chef who had appeared on national television. I waited until she was finished. Then I picked up my latte and told her I genuinely hoped the gala was everything she'd dreamed. I told her I loved her. I told her I hoped she chose her future carefully. She grabbed her tote and left without paying for her drink. I sat there for a while after, not because I was shaken, but because I had a lot to think about. I had a call scheduled that afternoon with Miles's legal team and a contact at the Nashville field office of the SEC. The documentation I'd been building for 4 months was complete. We had a filing date in mind, we had a date that would matter. Sterling's firm had been running a fairly elegant scheme for approximately 2 years. He'd been using client funds, retirement accounts, mostly from smaller institutional investors who trusted him, to take leveraged short positions against a basket of fintech companies, several of which were quiet early partners of Miles's. When those companies grew instead of collapsing the way Sterling needed them to, he needed cash to cover his margin exposure, and he'd been moving money between shell entities to buy time. The paper trail was, professionally speaking, not subtle. I had seen more sophisticated attempts at fraud, not many, but some. The morning of September 14th was warm and golden, the way early fall can be in Tennessee before the heat finally breaks for good. Miles and I were up before sunrise. He was calm in the way he always was, not performing calm, just genuinely at rest with himself, the way people are when they know exactly who they are. He made us both coffee. We stood on the screened porch of the main house and watched the light come up over the water. The estate was everything my family had imagined it wasn't. The main house was 4,000 square feet of reclaimed wood and glass, designed by an architect whose name I recognized from Architectural Digest. There were smaller guest houses for the handful of friends staying the whole weekend. There was a dock. There were strings of warm lights woven through the old trees that the florist and her team had been installing since Thursday. It did not look like a picnic. It looked like a dream someone had been patient enough to build correctly. Miles's company had gone public that morning. The IPO had been in the works for 8 months, quietly and carefully, at a valuation that surprised even the analysts who'd been watching the fintech space most closely. By 9 in the morning, the stock had opened at a price that put the company's total worth north of $400 million. Miles got the notification on his phone while we were still having coffee on the porch. He showed me the screen without saying anything. I leaned my head on his shoulder. He kissed the top of my head. He said, "You ready?" I said yes. Meanwhile, at the Pinnacle Hotel downtown, things were not going as planned. Sterling had arrived early, which was unusual, and had gone immediately to the private event coordinator's office on the 4th floor. The rooftop ballroom was set up. The catering team was arranging the tables. The jazz quartet was doing a sound check on the terrace. Everything looked exactly right. The problem was that the final payment scheduled to clear that morning from Sterling's business account had not cleared. The event coordinator was professional and pleasant about it. She said these things happened. A quick call to his bank would sort it out. She was sure it was just a processing delay. It was not a processing delay. Sterling stepped into the hallway and called his bank. Then he called his fund administrator. Then he called the attorney who handled his offshore entities. The first call went to voicemail. The second told him what he already feared: the accounts had been flagged and were under an administrative hold, pending a regulatory inquiry. The third call rang once and disconnected. He stood in that Pinnacle Hotel hallway in his custom suit and understood slowly what was actually happening. The SEC referral had been filed. The timing of Miles's IPO, the very stock Sterling's firm had been illegally shorting, had triggered a catastrophic margin call that wiped out the last liquidity buffer he'd been operating behind. The walls were closing in on all sides, in real time. On the morning of the gala, he had spent tens of thousands of dollars to plan. By the time my family arrived in the Pinnacle lobby, my mother in a formal dress, my father in a new blazer, my Aunt Phyllis with her husband, my cousin Wade and his wife, the event coordinator had returned with a second and considerably less pleasant update. The venue balance was due before guests could access the rooftop. If the balance wasn't cleared within the next 30 minutes, the event would be placed on administrative hold. Sterling told everyone it was a bank processing error. He said it with complete confidence. My mother told everyone to wait in the lobby. It would be sorted in minutes. These things happened with large wire transfers. 30 minutes passed, then 45. The jazz quartet stopped their sound check. The catering team came down from the rooftop and started asking questions. My Aunt Phyllis sat down on a lobby bench and took off her heels because her feet hurt. My father called Sterling's cell phone 4 times. Sterling did not answer because by then 2 federal agents had met Sterling in the parking garage beneath the hotel and asked him to come with them. He went. He didn't have a choice. The event coordinator informed my mother, quietly and without visible pleasure, that the event was canceled due to non-payment. The rooftop was being deconfigured, the catering company was packing their equipment, the hotel was sorry for the inconvenience, and would be in touch about any applicable refund of the initial deposit, though given the circumstances, that process might take some time. My mother stood in the lobby of the Pinnacle Hotel with her formal dress and her purse and no plan. She pulled out her phone and opened the news. The story about Miles's IPO was on the front page of the business section of the Tennessean. The headline was simple and large. Nashville fintech founder takes company public at $400 valuation. There was a photograph, not a stock photo, an actual photograph taken by a real photographer earlier that morning, the kind that gets taken when someone coordinates a media moment very deliberately. In the photo, Miles was standing in front of the main house on the lake property, and he was wearing a dark navy suit I had never seen before, and standing right beside him, her hand in his, was me. I was in a simple ivory dress. My grandmother's cameo caught the light from the ring on my left hand. The article described the estate. It described the wedding ceremony that would be taking place that afternoon, private and invitation only, for a guest list of close friends and professional allies. And it mentioned in the 3rd paragraph that the same financial documentation that had enabled the IPO's clean launch had also contributed to a federal investigation into a Nashville-based private equity firm whose managing partner had been taken into federal custody that morning on suspicion of securities fraud and misappropriation of client funds. My mother read that paragraph twice. My Aunt Phyllis leaned over and read it over her shoulder. My cousin Wade looked it up on his own phone. The lobby of the Pinnacle Hotel went very quiet. I know what happened next because a friend who works the front desk there told me about it the following week, laughing so hard she had to pause the story twice to collect herself. My mother started telling my father they needed to get out to the lake property right now. My Aunt Phyllis said she had not gotten dressed up and driven across town for nothing. My cousin Wade, who had called me difficult on Facebook 3 weeks earlier, started Googling the address. They filed out of the hotel and called 2 ride shares because there were too many of them for one car, and they rode 40 minutes out of the city toward the lake with diminishing dignity and rising desperation. The gate at the end of Miles's long driveway was attended by 2 members of the private security team he'd hired for the day. The gate itself was simple and wooden, not imposing at all from the road, which was intentional. What was behind it was something else entirely. My mother announced herself as the mother of the bride. The security team had a guest list. My mother was not on it, my aunt was not on it, my cousin Wade was not on it. My mother asked them to call up to the house. They did. They reached Miles's estate coordinator, who reached Miles, who looked across the room at me from where we were standing with our wedding guests near the water. He raised one eyebrow. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, standing there in my ivory dress in the late afternoon gold light with my grandmother's stone on my hand, and 60 people around me who had always meant it when they said they were glad I existed. I shook my head. Miles told the coordinator, "Not on the list, please ask them to leave." My mother, I was told, did not take this with grace. She insisted. She said she had rights. She said I would regret this. She said blood was blood. The security team was polite and completely unmovable, the way people are when they've been briefed well and paid fairly, and after a while my mother understood that no amount of insisting was going to move that gate. The ceremony happened at 4 in the afternoon with 62 guests on the lawn above the water. A judge who had known Miles since college officiated. I walked down the aisle by myself, and I want to say this clearly because it matters, that was not a sad moment. I had thought it might feel like an absence, and instead it felt like clarity. Every step belonged entirely to me. Every step was intentional. Every step moved me further from a version of myself that had spent years looking for approval from people who had decided before I opened my mouth that I wasn't worth it. We were on the back lawn cutting the cake when my phone vibrated in my small bag. I took it out and looked at the screen. A text from my mother, sent from my sister's phone because her own battery had died somewhere in the Pinnacle lobby. It said, "Cora, we made a mistake. We're outside the gate. Can we please come in? We just want to be here with you. We love you." I stood there for a moment looking at that message. The water behind us had gone copper and rose in the late light. Miles was laughing at something a friend had said to my left. The string quartet had started up again. Someone put a glass of champagne in my hand, and I took a sip and I looked at that text one more time. I typed back, "You're not on the list." Then I blocked my mother's number, then my sister's, then my Aunt Phyllis, then my cousin Wade. One by one in order, the way you close out a case file, methodically, without drama, because the only thing that matters is that it's done cleanly. I dropped my phone back into my bag and walked across the lawn to where Miles was standing, and he turned when he heard me coming, and the way he looked at me when I reached him. "I need you to understand that nothing about our life together looks the way my family thought it would look, and that is the only reason any of it works. That look has nothing to do with the estate or the IPO or the valuation or any of it. That look is built on 2.5 years of someone seeing you clearly, at your quietest and your most uncertain and your most stubborn, and deciding every single morning that you are exactly who they want to be standing next to. The rest of it is just the universe being efficient about things. For everyone listening to this who has spent years making yourself smaller so that someone in your family could feel bigger, I need you to hear this one thing. The people who laughed at your plans were not qualified to evaluate your life. The people who called your choices cheap and small were working with incomplete information, and also, frankly, they were working from envy they would never name out loud. And the people who abandoned you the moment something shinier came along were never the family you actually needed. You don't owe your future to the people who bet against you. You don't owe your peace to the people who spent years trying to take it. Set the boundary, lock the gate, let them stand outside in the afternoon heat with their formal outfits and their deflated expectations, and walk back across the lawn to the people who actually showed up. I found my person, I built something real, and on the best day of my life, the only people standing inside those gates were people who had always known I was worth showing up for. If this story found you at the right moment, hit subscribe and come find us at Bunny Revenge. Drop a comment and tell me about a time you finally closed a door on someone who was never going to walk through it correctly. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next story.